The final gap we're going to talk about, this is the effect gap. So what we want to happen versus what actually happens. Reality is always going to mess up our plans. A strategy is like a theory, a cognitive structure to simplify and explain the world and thereby facilitate action. This comes from Henry Mintzberg. I love how he speaks about strategy because he talks a lot about this idea of emergence. So that strategies can be adaptable and emerge, and they can come from the ground up, not always from the top down. He has this great little graphic that illustrates this, how like a planned strategy kind of comes in like Moses from on high, kind of hits us. And then as a team, we start to kind of play with it, adapt it, and we shape it to the realized strategy. And when you look at the definitions of strategy, almost everyone defines it as the plan. Very few people will talk about the reality that happens after the plan. And he calls that the realized strategy. And this idea of emergence makes a lot of sense if you know anything about systems thinking and complex problems. You know that organizations are like an organism, really complex behaviors arise. So that's perfect UX strategy that you have in your mind. You probably don't want it to happen exactly. You don't want it to realize exactly as you plan because that's too much control. The policy being super vague, allowing the kind of guidance of actions, there's always going to be a little bit of emergence. So the effects of your strategy are always going to be a little bit different than you planned. And that's okay. I think what's really nice about this is a lot of designers are going to be down here. They're not going to be so much up here. And in fact, many of the ways that you think about strategy, they come from this world of planning, strategic planning, they would call it. Henry Mintzberg calls that an oxymoron because he's like, you can't plan a strategy. It has to emerge. Now, that could be really depressing if you're a business strategist who is just constantly throwing plans at things. But I think as a designer, it's perfect because we can let things develop from the ground up. We're typically on the bottom of the totem pole, so it's helpful for us to think about going from the ground up and facilitating to the side, helping people around us till we get to that realized strategy. The unintended effects to the system, that's the effect. That can happen, especially in larger companies. You have no idea what's going to happen. Maybe there's surprising results, maybe good things, maybe bad things. You'll never know until you sort of launch your UX strategy. But strategy as a theory, I think is a really great way to think about strategy. I think it should kind of act as a theory. Sometimes it can get refuted. So the experiment track. If your strategy kind of acts like a theory, treat it like an experiment. I really like this because generally speaking, I think product managers, product leadership, they typically own like the roadmap. I'm not a big fan of roadmaps, but that's not something that designers typically own. So I do see a lot of designers defining UX strategy as creating a roadmap. And I just sit there and think of the pain of that busy design team who already has a roadmap they'll never deliver on, a roadmap that's made up of lots of stuff that isn't researched. And then you're going to throw another roadmap on them. That's why I think experiments is a better way to think about these. You're just going to go one at a time. You've got experiment one. That's kind of the first wave. You see how that goes. Experiment two, experiment three. And you're learning from each one. And you're not saying like, we're going to do 17 experiments next quarter. And here they are, get to work. It's fun to learn with people. And I think the experiment track is a great way to learn with the team. Everything you're learning will be helpful for all the work you're doing. You're still doing experiments on user behavior, human behavior. If it's internal or for the user, it's always still about human behavior. So the experiment track can be a really helpful way to learn. Now, strategy is a future-oriented practice. This is the futures cone. A lot of people will use this to talk about how the different futures can emerge. Many times, your strategy is going to be over here, the reality. It's not going to make it to where you want to be. That's because the future is complex. There's no way to predict it. And we think we can predict it, we are being a little bit naive. The experiment track, the way you do this is with users, with the other designers. Kind of think of it as like design team initiatives. You're running these experiments. It's kind of like data-driven prototyping. So putting stuff out there, kind of trying to realize that theory that your strategy represents, doing a lot of testing. This looks like evaluative research. You could even get into some UX metrics here that'll help you. I think the metrics are more important for the experiments than sort of your strategy overall, because you'll probably be given metrics to start your strategy project, but you can start to look at the metrics of the experiments. And the key skills here are experimentation and prototyping. A great story to illustrate this is something Henry Mintzberg talks about. He says that strategies are never created in a spreadsheet. people talk about IKEA being the shining example of strategy, business strategy. And people will say that like, they use this framework and that framework. And, just like Apple, everyone has like a reason for why they're successful. But he tells a story about how they decided that they were going to flat pack their furniture. So they were trying to load a table into a car and the leg of the table broke. So they were like, how are we going to fit this in the car? Oh, wait, it fits better. So a worker discovered that. And they were realizing how hard it was to fit the table in as a person working there. It's going to be even harder for a customer. So the whole strategy of flat packing the furniture came from experiments, from accidents, from sort of things that emerged. And it's such a surprising story because you always hear people saying like, IKEA, what a great strategy created by some consulting group. But that's sort of after the fact. A lot of things that people will turn into strategy are just sort of surprises, just running little experiments, being open to being wrong about things. So together, you could have these three tracks. You could use just one, just two, just three. But I think it could be really powerful if you use both. So you could have the sort of like parallel track of research and co-creation kind of happening along here. And then you sort of launch it, release it, and then you can run experiments, and then you can let the strategy adapt. That's probably going to be difficult for you to do. Maybe you don't do all three. I teach a course where we teach you the skills to do all three, and I think they're really important to overcoming those gaps. But maybe you saw some of your own skills in one of these three tracks. Start there. I think designers are usually strong in one of these three areas. Maybe, workshop design, facilitation, maybe doing research, maybe doing some data-driven prototyping. So I think there's some skills there that any designer will find. And of course, there's other ways to do it, but I think these three ways are a really nice way to get started. So what's there at that intersection? I would say it's research, co-creation, and experimentation. There's lots more that could be there, but I hope that you get in there and discover that for yourself.